even before Edward Snowden pulled back the curtain on the extent of the United States and the United Kingdom's mass surveillance programs, it was clear to people who were watching closely that surveillance technologies and their proliferation had outpaced democratic controls. And this was actually probably clear to everyone who saw how technology had transformed the way that we are tracked or not tracked. It used to be very common for us to be able to choose lives of practical obscurity, meaning that we were largely only seen, observed, and recorded by those who were immediately around us. That option has disappeared for all but the most hermetic and isolated individuals. And that's because the technologies from which we all benefit so much are, in effect, an elaborate spy system. Imagine something as simple as the phone. I can see that there are people in this room who remember when telephones were connected to the wall by cords, when you might even go into a phone booth and close the door. Last year, the New York Times said phone is probably not the right word for what most of us have in our pocket, because the activity of placing a phone call is one of the least common activities for that thing now. That tracker would be a better word for it.
One of the things that really struck me from the talk was the very idea that with agencies like the NSA and the GCHQ being hell-bent on surveillance, that they're imposing actual cracks in the fabric of the internet and infrastructure. That, you know, it's one thing to carry a phone and consider that a tracker, but the fact of the matter is, when we hear about security scandals, open doors, that the very people who are meant to be protecting us all are the people who are introducing these cracks.
I think it's a very, very important point that there is a fundamental tension between the mass surveillance that the NSA and the GCHQ are conducting and the kind of security that we need to be able to have freedom, to be able to have our economy run properly. Every time you read about a big hack or a breach or a Chinese cyber attack, those attacks exploit vulnerabilities in our system. At the same time, our intelligence agencies are creating and maintaining and hoarding those kinds of vulnerabilities rather than fixing them so that they can get in. We really have to make fundamental choices about what's more important to us. Having security on our networks, or allowing the kind of mass surveillance that the NSA and GCHQ are hell-bent on doing, as you say.
I mean, their motivation is, you could say in some cases, patriotic, or you could say misguided, or you could say maybe they're right about some things. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes down to it, one of the things that also stood out for me was the point you made about how a future attack is likely. It's not a give. It's not going to give them when it's going to happen, but it could happen, and it may well happen. But how well will they be prepared to actually be able to find the perpetrators, defend people from being attacked, if they're taking all this mass surveillance in?
Yeah, I think that there's no reason to believe that mass surveillance, mass collection, it will be of any use in identifying and stopping terrorist attacks. And that's because terrorism is extremely rare. Terrorists are different. Computers are not going to solve the problem of finding the digital needle in the world's biggest haystack. And so terrorism is the political justification for collecting all this information. What that information is really useful for is not for predicting the future, but for explaining the past. And you don't have to have even been a target yourself to have your life turned upside down by this kind of surveillance time machine. Look at the former CIA director in the United States, David Petraeus, and look at what happened to him. One woman sent a nasty anonymous email to a second one who reported it to the FBI, and the next week the FBI was pouring through thousands of private emails written by the CIA director, and he lost his job. I'm not defending necessarily the CIA director, but just pointing out that in a world where we record and store everything, the consequences down the line can be quite unexpected.
That the United States spends tens of billions of dollars a year building these programs and devotes some of the finest minds in the NSA to running and managing these programs. And that's money that is not being spent on other kinds of investigations. But the central point that I want to make about mass surveillance and security is that the structure of these mass surveillance programs, the way that they're created and run, actually undermines the communications infrastructure that we all depend on. for all of our other activities. Now, we've learned a lot about this in the last year. In a nutshell, the way that mass surveillance operates, the way that governments are able to do massive collection as opposed to targeted collection, depends on creating and maintaining vulnerabilities in the communications network. Some of you will have heard of vulnerabilities called 0 days. These are vulnerabilities in software and in programs that have been discovered by someone but not reported so they can be fixed. The NSA is a very, probably the most active participant on a global market for these vulnerabilities. The NSA is trying to purchase, identify, and stockpile weaknesses in the communication system so that it can exploit them for mass surveillance.
And that's the thing. I mean, one of the scenarios you put out there is that if and when something bad does happen and suddenly this big kettle drum of information that's been stored on every movement is opened up, that suddenly, it's not really law and order, it's a police state, and the wrong people. I mean, you brought the example up of when the Nazis invaded Holland and they were able to get really precise records of births and religions and put that to really nefarious use, that really we're facing a very grim future.
It's possible. I think that what protects us from the worst outcomes right now is nothing more than a set of rules, internal rules, not even necessarily, strong laws or constitutional principles. And Edward Snowden, for one, didn't believe that those rules would be strong enough to withstand a terrorist attack or a war. He thought that whatever restraints were being placed on his colleagues would be lifted in the face of that kind of trauma, and therefore we had to put those constraints on now rather than later when it might be too late. And this is something that American political leaders have been concerned about in the past. In the 1970s, Senator Frank Church, who led the first big investigation into the NSA, said that if these authorities were ever turned on the American people, we'd have no real defense against it. So we do need to worry about it.
Now, Edward Snowden, to a lot of people, he's a hero. To the authorities, he's someone that they want to get their hands on. But if you look back on what's happened in the last year and a half since all this came out, I mean, we've learned so much more about what's really going on. In your, as his attorney, obviously you'd have your own opinions on how he should be regarded for this. But do you think he's a hero? Or do you think some people might, that he'll ever be, properly treated as a hero, or that he'll always be on the run?
He is uncomfortable with terms like hero, but I'm not sure. I think he is. I think that he undertook enormous personal risk, and he did it with the best possible motivations. I do think already there has been a huge change in how he's perceived around the world from the early days, and even in the United States, although it's a little bit slower in the United States, and there are more hurt feelings in the intelligence community there than elsewhere. But look, if you had told me when I first connected with him in July of 2013 that a year later he would be considered a plausible candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, I would have said, we'll take it. I think history is kind to whistleblowers. I think history is much less kind to national security officials who claim that the sky is falling anytime their authority is threatened. So I hope and expect that we will have a better outcome for Edward Snowden someday.
He currently is residing in Moscow. Do you think he'll ever be able to set foot in the States again?
I hope so, and I do think so. He's just turned 31 years old. He has a long life ahead of him, and I think that as the years go by, as he collects more awards, as he's perceived around the world as someone who played a key role in launching this historic debate, the idea of punishing him is going to seem more and more silly. And it may not be under this president, it may be under the next or the one after, but at some point it's going to be possible to bring him home.
If the mass surveillance juggernaut continues, you mentioned there in your talk that agencies like the NSA are employing a lot of really bright mathematicians and graduates. Do you think we might see more people who might be disaffected at the methods and may emerge as future whistleblowers?
I think we've started to see it already. I think we know that there are other people in the intelligence community who have been providing information to journalists in the last year. There's at least 2 other leakers, if you will, who have provided information about U.S. intelligence activities, and I think you'll see more of that, and I think that you'll see actually that the NSA may soon have a harder time attracting the best and the brightest, and that more people will be seeking different careers if the values of the agency continue to depart so much from the values of the technology community.
Final question really is, what's missing between me as a civilian in any country in the Western world or anywhere else in the world and the mass surveillance that's happening? One of the points you made was that what's really missing is a judge in a lot of cases, and somebody basically to advocate what's right and what's wrong about this data that's being gathered. Would you be optimistic for the future that the right controls will be put in place?
I have to be optimistic. I'm more optimistic than I've been in more than a decade. I think that between the 9/11 attacks and the emergence of Edward Snowden, we made very little progress on these issues. So long as the cloak of secrecy was used to conceal what was going on and to prevent the public and the courts from adjudicating these questions, the government was able to continue to do its expansion. I think having this transparency was a critical step, a necessary step, not a sufficient step. It's really now on us, on the rest of us, to demand a different future.